The ceiling dripped because of course it did. This was Europa, ice, sludge, and an unending sense of existential dread. Captain Thane Garrow stood in the middle of what could generously be described as a control room, though it looked more like a scrapyard, had vomited on a garage sale. Consoles sparked, screens flickered like they were auditioning for a horror movie, and the fluorescent lights hummed with the enthusiasm of a mourning person at a funeral. "So," Thane drawled, his voice a mixture of gravel and sarcasm, "who's got the bad news? Because I could really use a pick-me-up." He scanned the room, a motley crew of rebels who looked like they could use a good shower or three, Doctor. Elise Rena pushed her way to the front, a wild-haired genius who looked perpetually one lab accident away from inventing something catastrophic. "The good news is, we're not dead yet. The bad news is, we're working on it. Alien bioengineered plague, folks. It's sweeping through the solar system faster than a politician on payday." Thane raised an eyebrow, pretending not to notice the hair that stood up like it was trying to make a break for it. "And what are we doing about it? Besides waiting to see if we start coughing up our lungs?" Elise shrugged, a gesture that said, "What can you do? We've got a plan. It's a bad plan, but it's the only one we've got." Thane snorted. "You had me at bad." He turned to the rest of the crew, who were engaged in various activities that ranged from mildly useful to utterly pointless. "All right, listen up. We've got an alien bug turning folks into mushy puddles of goo, and here we are stuck on an ice cube with about as much firepower as a wet noodle." A voice piped up from the back, belonging to a scrawny tech named Jax. "So business as usual then, pretty much," Thane responded, a grin tugging at his lips. "Now, Elise, what's our angle?" Elise adjusted her glasses, which immediately fogged up in the humid, sweating bunker. "Our angle, Captain, is to not die horribly. Hence, we're assessing what little resources we have to mount some kind of defense." Thane glanced around the room. A few functioning pulse rifles, a couple of drones that looked like they'd been assembled by a drunk engineer, and an assortment of what might have been explosive devices or particularly aggressive paperweights. "Resources," he mused. "Ain't life grand? I vote we start with the obvious," Elise said, tapping a map of the solar system that flickered intermittently on a table-sized screen. "We need to figure out where this plague is coming from." Jax leaned in, pointing at the map like a kid trying to decide which candy store to rob first. "I've got a buddy on Mars, says things are getting ugly there." "Ugly as in your mother-in-law is coming to visit, or the end is nigh kind of ugly?" Thane asked. "Ugly as in the end is nigh," Jax confirmed. "And not the good kind." "Fantastic," Thane muttered. "Elise, any wild theories, preferably ones that don't end with us turning into alien chow?" Elise chewed her lip, a sure sign that she was thinking, or that her last meal was still making its way through her digestive system. "There's a chance," she began slowly, "that this isn't a natural plague." Thane threw his hands up in mock celebration. "Oh, good. Because we were all worried this might be easy." "I mean it," Elise pressed, eyes alight with the kind of manic energy that usually meant someone was about to lose an eyebrow. "Imagine if someone engineered this thing." "Someone?" Jax cut in, eyes wide. "You mean like the aliens?" Elise shrugged. "Or someone who really hates us, who knows?" "Either way, it's not looking pretty." The room fell silent, the gravity of the situation finally sinking in like a lead balloon. Thane paced, boots clicking on the grated floor. "All right," he said finally, "we need intel, and we need it fast. Elise, you keep working on your mad scientist routine." "Jax, I want every scrap of information from Mars, Venus, hell, even Pluto if that's what it takes." "On it," Jax replied, already tapping away at a console that looked held together by spit and prayers. Thane turned his attention to the rest of the crew. "The rest of you, prep whatever's left of our defenses. I want this place locked down tighter than a miser's purse." "And what about us, Captain?" A voice called out from a shadowy corner, where two figures sat playing a game of cards with all the enthusiasm of prisoners on death row. "You too," Thane said, pointing at them, "are in charge of morale. Try not to depress everyone into an early grave, all right." The card players exchanged glances, one of them rolling their eyes. "You got it, boss. We'll keep the joy flowing like a broken sewage pipe." Thane nodded, satisfied. "That's the spirit. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got a date with a bottle of something strong enough to peel paint." He strode out of the control room, leaving behind the sounds of grumbling and the occasional explosion of static from the failing equipment. In the hallway, the dim lights flickered like they were auditioning for a horror flick, casting long shadows that writhed and twisted in the gloom. Thane made his way to his quarters, or what passed for them. A metal bunk, a desk cluttered with papers and half-finished bottles, and a view of the icy landscape outside that was as bleak as his prospects. He sank into a chair that creaked ominously under his weight, pouring himself a drink from a bottle that promised instant regret. "Cheers," he muttered to himself, raising the glass in a toast to the universe and all its infinite wisdom. The liquor burned its way down his throat, a welcome distraction from the chaos that awaited him. A knock on the door interrupted his moment of solitude. It was Elise, of course, her expression a mix of excitement and exasperation. "Got a minute, Captain?" Thane sighed, setting his glass aside. "For you, Elise, I've got a minute and a half. What's eating at you?" "I think I might have a lead," she said, words tumbling out like a runaway freight train. "On the plague, color me intrigued." Thane gestured for her to continue, though he had a sinking feeling this was going to involve more work and less drinking. Elise took a deep breath, as if preparing to dive into the deep end of a very treacherous pool. "There's a pattern to the outbreaks," she explained, "not random. Someone's guiding them, making it look like a cosmic accident." Thane leaned back, the chair protesting once more. "And you're sure about this?" "About as sure as I am that gravity works," she replied with a wry smile. "All right," Thane said, rubbing his temples as if that might somehow make the problem go away. "So we've got a mystery plague guided by an unseen hand. What's the next step in your grand plan, Doctor?" Elise hesitated, biting her lip. We have to go back to Earth." Thane blinked, not sure if he'd heard right. "Earth? You mean the boiling cesspool of overpopulation and political backstabbing?" "That Earth, that's the one," Elise confirmed, her eyes alight with determination. Thane groaned audibly, the weight of her words settling on his shoulders like a particularly unwelcome blanket. "You do realize that Earth's not exactly on our list of places we'd like to visit, right?" "I know." Elise nodded. "But if we're gonna solve this, we need to start where it all began." Thane gazed at the ceiling, as if hoping for divine intervention. "And you think our merry band of misfits can waltz into Earth, find the source of this plague, and get out without ending up as alien chow or government scapegoats?" Elise chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "I don't think we have a choice, Captain. It's do or die." Famous last words, Thane muttered. "All right then, let's gather the crew and break the bad news." Elise left, the door hissing shut behind her. Thane stared at the bottle for a long moment, then poured himself another drink. "To Earth," he toasted sarcastically. "May we be in and out before anyone notices." The crew gathered in the common room, a place that smelled faintly of desperation and questionable hygiene. Thane stood before them, his expression grim but determined. "Listen up, you sorry lot. We're headed to Earth." A chorus of groans and complaints erupted, each voice adding to the symphony of resistance. I know," Thane said, raising his hands for silence. "It's not exactly a vacation spot, but it's where we need to be." "And what if we say no?" Jax asked, arms crossed defiantly. Thane shrugged. "Then you can stay here and wait for the plague to come knocking." "Your choice." Elise stepped forward, her voice cutting through the grumbling like a surgeon's scalpel. "Look, I know this isn't ideal, but we've got a chance to make a difference. To stop this thing before it wipes us all out." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them like a shroud. "All right," Thane said finally, nodding to himself. "Let's get this over with." As the crew began to prepare for their journey, Thane couldn't shake the feeling that they were charging headlong into disaster. But then that was nothing new. He only hoped they'd live long enough to regret it. The ship hummed to life, engines thrumming with the promise of impending doom. Thane settled into the captain's chair, strapping himself in for what was sure to be a rough ride. "Here's to us," he muttered, gripping the controls with white-knuckled determination. And with that they plunged into the unknown, a ragtag band of rebels with nothing to lose and everything to gain. The stakes were high, the odds were long, and the universe watched with bated breath, waiting to see what kind of mess they'd make of things this time. "All right, strap in and prepare to breathe the delightful mix of despair and recycled air," Thane quipped, watching the crew settle into their stations as they left Europa's icy surface behind. The ship's engines grumbled like an old man waking up without coffee, propelling them away from the moon's weary embrace. In the control room, the atmosphere was as tense as a visit to the in-laws, without the promise of free food. Elise sat at a console, her fingers dancing over controls in a rhythm only she understood. Jax hovered nearby, pretending to understand the chaos of blinking lights and beeping alerts. "Remind me again why we're diving into the biggest cesspool in the solar system," Jax asked, peering at a screen that seemed to display more static than useful data. "Because, Jax, if we can figure this out, we might just save the universe," Elise replied with a grin, her eyes alight with the kind of manic glee usually reserved for mad scientists and lottery winners. "Or at least save ourselves from becoming alien hors d'oeuvres," Thane added, leaning back in his chair. "Now, Elise, spill the details on this paradox thing you mentioned." "Let's pretend I'm not a genius for a second. Paradox is our middle name, Captain," Elise said, half joking. "The plague affects humans differently because of our unique cognitive dissonance. We say one thing, do another, and somehow convince ourselves we're not complete idiots." "Speak for yourself, Doc," Jax interjected, smirking. "I'm perfectly aware I'm an idiot. That's what makes us so charmingly unpredictable," Elise continued, ignoring Jax's comment. "This dissonance confuses the plague's alien biology. It's trying to adapt to us, but we're like a moving target. So we're too stupid for the plague to kill us efficiently, Thane asked, raising an eyebrow. Pretty much, Elise replied with a shrug. Think of it as our paradoxical nature being both our greatest weakness and our ultimate advantage. Great, so how do we weaponize our charming incompetence? Thane mused, half serious. That's where things get tricky, Elise admitted. We need to run tests, see what kind of paradoxes trigger the strongest response. It's like we're trying to figure out which shade of stupid is the most effective. Well, I've got a lifetime of experience being stupid, Jax offered. Just point me in the right direction. Thane chuckled, the sound a rare reprieve from the oppressive tension. All right, folks, let's get to work. Elise, you figure out how exactly we poke this plague with our collective idiocy. Jax, stay close and try not to break anything expensive. Aye, Captain, Jax saluted, already moving to assist Elise. The two of them began sorting through data, their task akin to untangling a particularly stubborn knot. Meanwhile, Thane stared out the viewport, watching the void slip past like a river of ink. Earth loomed in their future, a blue-green marble of chaos and opportunity. He took a deep breath, the recycled air tasting faintly of metallic regret. Captain, Elise called, breaking his reverie. I've got something. Color me intrigued, Thane responded, walking over to join them. What's the verdict? Elise tapped a screen, highlighting a series of graphs that looked like the doodles of a deranged artist. Notice these spikes. They occur whenever a subject experiences extreme cognitive dissonance. English, Doc, Thane reminded her. Right. Basically, when people act contrary to their expectations or beliefs, the plague reacts violently, trying to adapt. It's like watching a cat chase a laser pointer, so we need to harness our inner hypocrites for the greater good, Thane asked, crossing his arms. Exactly, Elise nodded. If we can stimulate this reaction in a controlled environment, we might just be able to disrupt the plague's biology. Controlled environment, huh, Jack said. I've got an ex-wife that could cause dissonance just by breathing. She available for testing? Sorry, Jax, Elise laughed. We'll have to make do without her. Thane leaned over the console, studying the data. All right, so how do we test this without blowing ourselves up? Carefully, Elise said, with a confidence that implied anything but, great. Grab some volunteers and let's see if we can confuse the plague to death, Thane decided, shaking his head at the absurdity. The crew gathered in the makeshift lab, a room that bore a striking resemblance to a junkyard, if junkyards had hazardous material warnings plastered everywhere. Elise stood at the front, explaining the plan like a teacher addressing a room full of particularly dense students. So we're going to simulate scenarios that cause cognitive dissonance, Elise explained. Think of the most contradictory situation you can and let it play out. The more confused you feel, the better, like watching a politician make a promise. Someone called out, earning a round of laughter. Exactly, Elise confirmed, grinning. We'll monitor the biological response and see what happens. Thane watched from the back, arms crossed. The crew's skepticism was palpable, but there was a glimmer of hope. A fool's hope, maybe, but hope nonetheless. All right, let's get this circus on the road, he announced. Elise, you ready? Ready as I'll ever be, Elise replied, adjusting her equipment. The first test subject stepped forward, a burly engineer whose idea of cognitive dissonance probably involved deciding between two brands of instant noodles. All right, think about your last argument with your significant other, Elise instructed, and then act like you're completely in the right. That's easy, the engineer laughed. I'm always right, the crew snickered, the atmosphere lightening slightly. As the test proceeded, the monitors beeped and flashed with data, Elise and Jax watching intently. Look at this, Jax whispered, pointing at the screen. The plague's trying to adapt, but it's like watching a dog chase its own tail. Interesting, Elise mused, adjusting the parameters. Let's try something else, more intense. They cycled through subjects, each one inducing their own brand of paradoxical behavior. The results were encouraging, but still nebulous, a glimpse of hope wrapped in a puzzle. Finally, Thane stepped forward, arms crossed. All right, let me give it a shot. Elise raised an eyebrow, surprised. You sure, Captain, why not? Thane shrugged. I've got a lifetime of contradictions to draw from. As Thane took his place, he focused on a memory that never failed to spark turmoil, the day he became captain. The burden of leadership, the thrill of command, the crushing fear of screwing up, it was all there, a neat package of chaos. The monitors went wild, beeping and flashing like a disco from hell. Elise and Jax exchanged glances, excitement mingling with disbelief. Look at that response, Elise murmured, eyes glued to the screen. We've got something here. Seems my existential crisis was good for something, Thane quipped, stepping back. Elise nodded, her mind racing. We need to refine this, find the optimal parameters. But it's a start. All right, take what you need and let's get this plan in motion, Thane instructed, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. The crew dispersed, leaving Elise and Jax to their work. Thane lingered, watching them with a mix of pride and trepidation. You think this'll work? Jax asked quietly as the room emptied. I hope so, Elise replied, her tone somber. But if it doesn't, at least we'll go down fighting. Famous last words, Jax muttered, returning to his console. Thane wandered back to the bridge, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. The plan was as insane as it was brilliant, a desperate gamble in a game with no guarantees, but they had no other choice. Earth drew closer, its vibrant colors a stark contrast to the bleakness of their mission. Thane settled into the captain's chair, staring at the screen with grim determination. Here's to us, he whispered, echoing his earlier toast. May our stupidity save the universe yet. Time passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety, the crew working tirelessly to refine their newfound weapon. They were a ragtag bunch, held together by duct tape and defiance, misfits with a mission. Finally, the day arrived. Earth loomed large on the view screen, a tantalizing prize shrouded in danger. The crew assembled once more, their expressions a blend of hope and resignation. All right, listen up, Thane began, his voice carrying the authority of a man with nothing left to lose. We're about to dive headfirst into the lion's den. But remember, we've got something the plague doesn't, our unique brand of crazy. The crew chuckled, the tension easing slightly. Thane glanced at Elise, who nodded encouragingly. We've refined the process, she explained. We'll deploy a series of dissonance-inducing scenarios and hopefully disrupt the plague's biology long enough to make a difference. And if we don't, someone asked, their voice tinged with fear. Then we'll go down fighting, Thane replied, echoing Elise's words. But I have a feeling we might just pull this off. With a final nod, Thane turned back to the controls, the crew following suit. The ship descended towards Earth, engines roaring with defiance and determination. As they entered the atmosphere, Thane whispered a silent prayer, not to any deity, but to the universe itself. Here's to us, he muttered, gripping the controls with white-knuckled determination. The screen flickered, displaying the sprawling chaos of Earth below. It was time to test their theory, to see if humanity's inherent contradictions could save them all. In the end, it was a fool's hope that drove them, a gamble against insurmountable odds. But sometimes, Thane mused, that was all you needed. And so they plunged into the fray, a ragtag band of rebels armed with nothing but wit and desperation. They were humanity's last, best hope, a paradox in the making. Thane Garrows leaned back in his chair with the kind of wary comfort one reserves for unstable furniture. The control room was a veritable junkyard of half-functional tech, but it was home. Or as close to home as a drifting tin can infested with life-threatening alien goo could ever be. The ship's engines grumbled beneath him, like a hungover old man woken from a fitful nap, and Thane couldn't help but share the sentiment. The plan to utilize human cognitive dissonance as a weapon was moving along, but like most plans conceived in desperation, it came with a generous side of chaos. Dr. Elise Rena was in the lab, which Thane had mentally dubbed the lair of dubious science. Rena was a genius, a wild-haired, wild-eyed, perpetually on the edge of a breakthrough kind of genius. Whether she'd break through to a solution or just break everything remained to be seen. Elise had hatched a new experiment, the kind that made Thane's metaphorical hackles rise. It involved introducing captured alien organisms to human paradoxes, as if any sane person would willingly cozy up to an alien plague. Think of it like a cosmic game of chicken, Elise had explained earlier, her enthusiasm bordering on manic. Only the chicken is a bioengineered plague, and the road is paved with our stupidity. Got it, Thane had replied, deadpan. We're aiming to confuse the galaxy to death. The control room bustled with nervous energy, the crew's collective dread almost audible. Jax, the crew's resident pretender of competence, hovered nearby, fingers dancing over the controls like a maestro who'd skipped half the rehearsals. Jax, how are we looking? Thane asked, trying to keep the impatience out of his voice. It was like asking a toddler if they'd seen your car keys. All systems are A-go, Jax replied, with a confidence that was about as reassuring as a paper parachute. Well, mostly. Mostly doesn't inspire confidence, Jax, Thane drawled, rubbing his temples, but I guess it's par for the course. Across the room, Elise was huddled over a console, her fingers tapping out a rhythm that only she seemed to comprehend. Her focus was razor-sharp, but Thane knew it wouldn't take much to tip her into a rant about the universe's general incompetence. Status, Elise, Thane called, interrupting her flow. We've got the alien samples contained, Elise replied, not looking up. They look like angry jello, but we've got them. Great, Thane muttered. Angry jello. Just what I wanted in my nightmares. Elise grinned, finally meeting his gaze. Don't worry, Captain. If they get loose, just remember, they're more scared of us than we are of them. Why? Because we're an unpredictable mess. Exactly. As the experiment prepared to take off, the air in the room was thick with tension. You could cut it with a knife, but everyone was too busy clutching their metaphorical duct tape seatbelts to wield any cutlery. Let's go over this again, Thane said, his voice steady despite the quagmire of doubt. We're going to introduce paradoxes to the alien samples. We need to see how they react and whether they go into meltdown or just get mildly peeved. Elise nodded. Exactly. We need to find the sweet spot, enough dissonance to scramble their circuits without sending them into a frenzy. Great, so we're looking to annoy them, not enrage them. I can do that, Thane said with a sardonic smile. I've been doing it to humans for years. Jax chuckled, his nervous energy radiating like a small, jittery sun. Yeah, you're a regular maestro of irritation, Captain. The air shifted with a collective inhale as Elise set the experiment in motion. Monitors beeped and screens flickered, displaying patterns that meant nothing to the untrained eye but were gospel to Elise. This is it, she murmured, her excitement barely contained. We're about to make history or a mess. Let's hope for history, Thane quipped. Though with our luck we'll get both. The alien organisms, sealed in their containment units, looked about as threatening as green jelly, but Thane knew better than to underestimate anything that could wipe out humanity with a sneeze. Here goes nothing, Elise muttered, initiating the experiment. The room held its breath, figuratively, since literal breath-holding would probably end poorly aboard a spaceship. As the paradox scenarios played out, the alien organisms reacted, feebly at first, like a drunk waking up to find they're late for work. But then, unpredictably, they began to writhe, their gelatinous forms shifting as if trying to escape their own skins. Look at that, Elise breathed, her eyes wide. They're reacting, it's working. I'll be damned, Thane said, a reluctant admiration creeping into his voice. You might actually pull this off. But as the organisms continued to react, the mood in the room began to shift. What had started as cautious optimism was morphing into something else entirely, an undercurrent of fear. Elise, Jack said, his voice tinged with alarm. Is it supposed to do that? Elise squinted at the readings, her expression tightening with concern. The organisms were reacting more violently than anticipated, their forms twisting in a dance of unpredictable motion. It's reacting too strongly, Elise admitted, her fingers flying across the console. I need to adjust the parameters. Do it quickly, Thane urged, his voice a low growl, before we end up on the wrong end of a cosmic meltdown. Tensions mounted, the air thick with the acrid tang of fear. The alien samples continued their violent contortions, a macabre ballet that held the room transfixed. I've got it, Elise declared, making a swift adjustment. The organisms thrashing slowed, their wild movements settling into a more manageable chaos. Nice save, Doc, Thane said, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Remind me to never play poker with you. Elise managed a shaky laugh, relief mingling with exhaustion. Yeah, I don't bluff, I just panic. Despite the fact that the immediate crisis was averted, the implications settled over the crew like a shroud. The experiment had worked, but only just. The potential for disaster loomed large, a grim reminder of the knife's edge they danced on. The crew gathered around Thane, their expressions a mix of relief and uncertainty. They had a weapon, sure, but wielding it was another matter entirely. So, what's next, Captain? One of the crew members asked, voicing the question on everyone's minds. Thane rubbed his chin, his thoughts a whirl of conflicting plans and potential pitfalls. We need to refine the process, he said slowly. We can't afford for things to go pear-shaped. Agreed, Elise said, her voice steady once more. We need to test further under controlled conditions. Jax, ever the voice of irreverence, piped up. Controlled conditions. On this ship, that would be a first. Thane smirked. We'll take what we can get. As the crew dispersed to prepare for the next round of testing, a quiet tension lingered, a tension born of shared purpose and mutual doubt. They were trying to save humanity with a plan that held together by little more than spit and stubbornness. You think we can really do this? Jax asked as he joined Thane at the viewport. Earth was a distant speck, a reminder of everything they stood to lose. Thane shrugged, the motion nonchalant but heavy with implication. I think we have to try. It's either that or sit here and wait to die, and I've never been much for waiting. Jax nodded, a rueful smile tugging at his lips. Yeah, well, if we're gonna go out, at least we'll go out swinging. Thane chuckled softly, the sound almost lost to the hum of the ship. Damn right, and who knows? We might just surprise ourselves. The next few days passed in a blur of activity and strained camaraderie. The crew worked tirelessly to refine their approach, each success tempered by the ever-present specter of failure. But it wasn't just the plague they battled. There were cracks appearing within the crew, dissent simmering beneath the surface. Not everyone was convinced of the plan's viability, and the tension threatened to boil over. In an impromptu meeting in the galley, the issue finally came to a head. The crew, gathered around a table littered with mugs and datapads, exchanged wary glances. I'm just saying, one of the engineers, Vera, began, arms crossed defiantly. We're putting all our eggs in one basket. A basket that's held together with wishful thinking and a bit of string. Elise bristled, her patience frayed by the constant pressure. We don't have a choice, Vera. We're out of options and running out of time. But what if it doesn't work? Vera pressed, her voice rising. What if we make things worse? Thane watched the exchange, his expression inscrutable. He understood Vera's fear. Hell, he shared it, but they had no room for internal strife. Enough, he said quietly, the word cutting through the tension like a blade. We all know the risks. We also know what's at stake. Vera met his gaze, defiance tempered by understanding. I just don't want us to be the ones who screw it all up. Neither do we, Thane replied, his voice a low rumble. But we've got to try something. If we fail together. But if we succeed, he let the thought trail off, the unspoken hope lingering like a challenge. Fine, Vera said at last, her resolve softening. But if we're going down this road, we'd better be damn sure we know where it leads. Agreed, Thane said, relief coloring his tone. Now let's get back to it. We've got a universe to save. As the meeting broke up, Thane caught Elys's eye, a shared understanding passing between them. The path ahead was uncertain, but they were committed, misfits united by a singular, desperate cause. Later, as the ship hurtled through the void, Thane returned to his chair, the weight of command settling around him like an old coat. The engines grumbled beneath, a counterpoint to the tumult within. He gazed out at the endless expanse, the stars winking like conspirators in a cosmic joke. It was a gamble, all of it. But then life was a gamble, a series of dice rolls where the stakes were never quite clear. Here's to us, Thane murmured, a wry smile tugging at his lips. May we defy the odds and live to tell the tale. And as the ship continued its journey, adrift on a sea of uncertainty, Thane held onto that hope, fragile, foolish, and fiercely defiant. Thane Garrows leaned back in his creaky chair, which protested like an old man waking up, and surveyed the control room. It looked like a disaster relief yard sale had thrown up, and he was the proud owner of the chaos. The faint hum of the engines underscored the ship's uneasy peace, but he wasn't fooled. Peace was just the universe taking a deep breath before it belched a fresh mess. He glanced at Dr. Elise Renna, who sat at her console, fingers dancing over the keys like a pianist who'd lost the sheet music, but decided to improvise anyway. Her latest experiment had worked, sort of. The alien organisms reacted to human cognitive dissonance like a cat reacting to a cucumber, confused and slightly homicidal. They'd weakened the alien defenses, sure, but now came the tricky part, not dying horribly. Jax was already at his post, trying to look busy, while probably achieving the digital equivalent of doodling dicks in the margins. You know, Captain, I always thought we'd die in a more traditional way, like, I don't know, crashing into a sun or something. Dream big, Jax, Thane replied, his sarcasm as sharp as an unshaven jawline. But there's always next week. Before Jax could conjure up a retort, Elise spoke up, her voice carrying the excitement of a kid with a new chemistry set and a distinct lack of supervision. We're onto something, Thane. The organism's defense mechanisms are shot. The paradoxes scrambled them good. Right, so we're winning, Thane said, crossing his arms. Call me when we're not still utterly screwed, as if the universe itself was listening, and it probably was, just to mess with them. A shrill alarm blared through the control room. The sound was catastrophic, like a wedding band trying to play heavy metal. What now? Thane muttered, already knowing the answer was likely to ruin his day. Elise's console lit up with new data, her eyes scanning the readouts with a mixture of fascination and terror. Another wave of the plague is on its way, bigger, meaner, and with a chip on its shoulder. Great, Thane said, exasperated. Like we needed more reasons to regret not retiring early. The crew gathered around, their faces a tableau of dread and determination. Each had their own ticks and quirks, but together they were a tapestry of dysfunction that somehow held the line against the universe's worst. Suggestions? Thane asked, hoping for a miracle and expecting a migraine. Elise stood, her expression the embodiment of calculated madness. We need to double down on the paradoxes. If a little cognitive dissonance scrambles them, maybe a lot will make them implode. Jack shook his head, a wry grin on his face. So you're saying we need to confuse the hell out of them, make them question their life choices? Exactly, Elise replied, her eyes gleaming. We flood them with our most illogical thoughts and actions. Overload their systems. Thane rubbed his temples, the weight of leadership and impending doom settling heavily on his shoulders. Sounds like we're weaponizing crazy. I can work with that. Vera, the engineer with a penchant for pessimism, folded her arms. What if they adapt? What if they get smarter? Then we outsmart them, Thane said, his voice firm despite the undercurrent of doubt. We've been doing it to ourselves for millennia. Time to put that masochistic talent to use. The crew exchanged glances, a silent agreement forming amidst the chaos. It was a plan born of desperation, but it was all they had. All right, Thane said, clapping his hands to signal the end of the impromptu gathering. Let's get to work. We need every paradox, contradiction, and nonsensical plan you can come up with. Make it so confusing that the aliens will beg for mercy. As the crew dispersed to their stations, Jack sidled up to Thane, a hint of mischief in his eyes. You know, if this works, we'll have to put professional confusers on our resumes. Thane chuckled, the sound soaked in irony. Add survivor of stupidity while you're at it. With no time to waste, they set the plan in motion. Elise and Jax worked together to program a series of paradoxes that would give even a philosophy professor a headache. Thane oversaw the operation, his eyes flicking between his crew and the looming threat on the monitors. Ready? Elise asked, her fingers poised over the console's initiate button. Thane nodded, a grim smile on his face. As I'll ever be, let's show these aliens what real confusion looks like. Elise hit the button, and the ship systems whirred into action, broadcasting a symphony of contradictions that would make a politician blush. They waited, the tension thick as the realization that their lives might well depend on the power of pure nonsense. The alien wave hit, and for a moment it seemed all was lost. But then, improbably, the data on Elise's screen began to shift. The alien presence faltered, their biological systems struggling against the barrage of illogical stimuli. It's working, Elise exclaimed, her voice tinged with relief and disbelief. Of course it is, Thane said, trying not to sound too smug. Humans have been baffling each other for centuries. These aliens didn't stand a chance, but as much as they wanted to celebrate, the battle was far from over. The alien forces, though weakened, were still formidable. They wouldn't go down without a fight, and neither would the crew. Prepare for round 2, Thane ordered, his voice carrying the weight of command. We're not out of this yet, Jax, stationed at his console, shot Thane a cheeky grin. You know, Captain, I always knew we'd save the world with stupidity. I just didn't think it'd be so literal. Keep that spirit, Jax, Thane replied, appreciating the levity. It might be the only thing keeping us together. With the strategy in place, the crew worked tirelessly to maintain their advantage. Elise continued to adjust the parameters, ensuring the aliens remained off balance. Vera and the engineers reinforced the ship's defenses, preparing for any counterattack. As the minutes stretched into hours, the control room buzzed with activity and tension. Despite the odds, there was a sense of unity, a shared belief that they could pull this off. I think we're actually doing it, Vera said, her voice betraying a hint of disbelief. Don't jinx it, Thane warned, glancing at her with a stern expression. We're not out of the woods yet. The alien presence was faltering, their forces in disarray as the paradoxes continued to wreak havoc. Slowly but surely, the tide was turning in the crew's favor. Keep pushing, Thane urged, the fire of determination burning in his eyes. We've got them on the ropes. It was an all-out battle of wits and willpower, and the crew fought with everything they had. The odds were long, but desperation and ingenuity were on their side. Jax monitored the situation, his fingers dancing over the controls with an ease that belied his nerves. You know, this might be the first time I've felt optimistic in days. Don't let it go to your head, Thane teased, though he couldn't deny the flicker of hope that had taken root within him. Stay focused. As the alien forces continued to falter, the crew pressed their advantage. The paradoxes, relentless and absurd, did their work, unraveling the alien defenses with each passing moment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the alien presence began to retreat. The monitors showed the plague receding, the threat diminishing as the crew's efforts bore fruit. We did it, Elise said breathlessly, her eyes wide with awe. We actually did it. Thane allowed himself a moment of relief, the weight of the crisis lifting ever so slightly from his shoulders. Damn right we did. The control room erupted in cheers, the crew celebrating their improbable victory. They'd faced the impossible and emerged triumphant, their resolve and ingenuity carrying the day. But as the initial rush of success faded, Thane knew their work wasn't done. They'd won a battle, but the war against the plague was far from over. All right, everyone, Thane said, his voice cutting through the celebration. Let's not get complacent. We've still got a universe to save. The crew nodded, their expressions a mix of determination and renewed purpose. They'd faced the darkness and come out stronger for it, but the journey ahead was still fraught with danger. As Thane looked out at the vast expanse of space, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They were a ragtag bunch, a mismatched assembly of misfits and rebels, but they'd proven their worth. In the face of overwhelming odds, they'd shown the universe that humanity wouldn't go quietly into the night. They'd fight with every ounce of their being, armed with nothing more than grit, determination, and a stubborn refusal to give up. Here's to us, Thane murmured, a wry smile on his lips. May we keep defying the odds. And as the ship continued its journey, propelled by hope and a fierce determination to survive, Thane held onto that belief. They'd come this far and they weren't about to back down now. Not today, not ever. The control room, resembling a scrapyard on a bad day, buzzed with a new kind of tension. It was the kind that made you wonder if you'd left the stove on before embarking on a journey where survival was more of a suggestion than a guarantee. Fantastic, Thane grumbled, clutching his side where a newly minted bruise was blossoming beneath his shirt. I always wanted to lead a team in a bunker breach with a side of alien apocalypse. Jax, ever the comedian, peered up from a pile of debris that used to be his console. Look on the bright side, Captain. At least if we die, the paperwork will be someone else's problem. The alien plague, with all the charm of a tax audit, had breached their defenses. Supplies were thinner than a politician's promise, and the crew was scattered, like some cosmic joke gone horribly wrong. Thane, stumbling to his feet, wondered if his ribs were auditioning for a percussion section. Every breath hurt, like every other part of his existence these days. Elise Renna, the mad scientist with a penchant for chaos, wasn't faring much better. She'd taken charge of the defense, barking orders like a drill sergeant having an off day. Jax, if you're done with the stand-up routine, get the power rerouted. We need every bolt of juice we can muster. Jax saluted with 2 fingers, a lazy gesture that said he was either brave or just really bad at appreciating the gravity of their situation. Aye, Doc. Don't worry, I'll have it up and running faster than you can say existential crisis. Vera, the engineer with a terminal case of realism, appeared carrying what looked like the wreckage of a toaster. Our power grid looks worse than last week's lasagna, she said, dropping the contraption onto the floor with a clang that echoed like a death knell. Time to get creative then, Thane said, wincing as he moved. If we're going down, we're doing it with style, and maybe a little insanity. More insanity than style knowing us, Elise replied, her fingers flying over the console as if trying to coax secrets from a stubborn lover. We need a miracle, and since I'm fresh out, we'll have to make do with sheer human stubbornness. The bunker, once a bastion of hope, now felt more like a coffin in waiting. Walls that might as well have been made of paper, considering the pressure they buckled under. The plague was relentless, a ruthless force that cared little for human tenacity or Thane's aspirations of early retirement on a beach somewhere far, far away. Captain, Jax's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and urgent. We've got movement on the perimeter. More of them, and they don't look like they've come for tea and biscuits. Wonderful, Thane muttered, not even attempting to mask his disdain. As if things weren't peachy enough without an alien cocktail party. The crew, battered and bruised, rallied around him, each wearing expressions that ranged from "I've had better days" to "I can't believe I'm getting paid for this." Not that any of them were actually getting paid. Currency had taken a backseat to survival some time ago. Elise took a deep breath, steeling herself. We need to hold them off long enough to get the paradoxes fully operational. If we don't, well, let's just say we'll have front-row seats to our own extinction. Thane nodded, his mind a whirl of pain and plans that could barely pass for sane. Right, we've made it this far with a combination of dumb luck and questionable decision-making. Let's push our luck just a bit further. Jax, who seemed to thrive on the edge of disaster, grinned. I'm ready when you are, Captain. Let's show these aliens what happens when humans run out of patience and coffee. The plan was as simple as it was desperate. Hold the line against creatures bent on their annihilation, while Elise worked her scientific magic. It wasn't elegant, but then again, neither was life when it involved dodging death at every turn. Thane, ignoring the protests of his ailing body, moved to the makeshift barricade at the entrance. He was armed with a weapon that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never actually seen a gun and a heart full of existential dread. Let's give them a welcome they won't forget, he said, his voice a gravelly promise. The first wave hit like a freight train made of nightmares. The aliens surged forward, their grotesque forms a testament to evolution gone wrong. It was a cacophony of chaos, noise, and a sprinkle of panic. Thane fired, each shot accompanied by a silent prayer that the universe wasn't quite done with him yet. Elise worked feverishly, her console a blur of lights and data. Just a bit longer, she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. Hold them off and we might just have a chance. Jax was a whirlwind of activity, his humor as sharp as his aim. You know, Captain, this wasn't exactly how I pictured spending my Tuesday. Yeah, Thane shot back, reloading with the speed of someone who'd long accepted that life was a series of unfortunate events. I was hoping for spa day myself. Vera joined them, her presence a comforting reminder that not all hope was lost. The power's back up. We're running on borrowed time, but we've got enough to make them regret trying to ruin our day. The battle waged on, each minute feeling like a lifetime. Thane could hear his crew's fear in every breath, but he also heard their determination, a stubborn refusal to let the universe get the last laugh. They were fighting for more than survival. They were fighting for each other, and for the slim hope that tomorrow might be better than today. Elise's voice broke through the turmoil, a lifeline in the madness. Paradoxes are ready, Captain. Let's show these bastards what happens when they mess with the masters of cognitive dissonance. Thane grinned, a fierce, wild thing that spoke of defiance in the face of doom. On my mark, unleash hell. The crew braced themselves for the final act of their desperate gamble. Elise's fingers hovered over the control, poised to deliver the unlikeliest of weapons, pure, unadulterated nonsense. Now, Thane barked, his voice a rallying cry. Elise activated the sequence, and the makeshift defense system whirred to life, broadcasting a symphony of contradictions that could make a paradox professor cry. The alien advance faltered, their forms writhing as they struggled against the onslaught of illogical stimuli. The crew held their breath, the room a tense tableau of hope and fear. For a moment, it seemed as though they'd overplayed their hand. But then slowly the tide began to turn. The alien forces, confused and disoriented, began to retreat. "We're doing it," Vera said, her voice thick with relief. "Keep pushing," Thane urged, feeling the weight of the world lifting, if only slightly. The aliens, their biological systems unraveling under the paradoxical assault, started to fall back. The monitors showed their retreat, a reluctant acknowledgement that the human weapon of cognitive dissonance had struck a decisive blow. "We're actually doing it," Elise said, disbelief mingling with the triumph in her voice. Thane, battered but unbroken, allowed himself a small smile. "Damn right, never underestimate the power of human stupidity." It's our best trait. The bunker, once a place of despair, now stood as a symbol of resilience. The crew had faced their darkest hour and emerged with victory in their grasp, proof that even in the bleakest of times, hope could be found. As the adrenaline faded, leaving only exhaustion and a quiet sense of accomplishment, Thane addressed his crew. "We've won this round, but the game's not over. They'll be back and we need to be ready." Jax, ever the optimist in a cynical sort of way, chuckled. "Guess we'll need to come up with more paradoxes. I'm thinking cats and dogs living together, or politicians telling the truth." Thane couldn't help but laugh, a sound tinged with relief and camaraderie. "Sounds like a plan. Let's keep them guessing and keep ourselves alive." The crew, bonded by shared struggle and a newfound sense of purpose, nodded in agreement. They'd faced the abyss and lived to tell the tale, but they knew the journey was far from over. As they regrouped and prepared for the next challenge, Thane reflected on the trials they'd endured. They were a flawed, stubborn, and irreverent bunch, but they were also survivors. In a universe that seemed determined to see them fail, they'd shown that humanity wasn't ready to be written off just yet. "Here's to us," Thane murmured, a toast to the crew that had become more than just a team, they were family. And as they stood together, bruised but unbowed, Thane knew they'd keep fighting, keep defying the odds, and keep proving that in the grand scheme of things, humans were a force to be reckoned with, armed with nothing more than their wit, their will, and a little bit of madness. Thane Garrows leaned against the console, clutching his side where the makeshift bandage was doing a piss-poor job of keeping his insides, well, inside. The control room scratched that, the chaos room, looked like a scrapyard that had gone through a blender. It was a miracle the place hadn't blown to bits yet. A miracle, Thane mused, brought to you by duct tape, caffeine, and good old-fashioned human desperation. Dr. Elise Renna, looking like a mad scientist who'd swapped her lab coat for a straitjacket, was fiddling with her console. She was muttering about human resilience and some groundbreaking discovery about the human psyche. Thane had long since given up trying to understand half the words coming out of her mouth. If it involved science, aliens, or both, he left it to her. "Thane, I think I've found something," Elise said, her eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and sleep deprivation. "Something that could give us a real edge." "Great," Thane replied, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "because the last edge we had was about as sharp as a butter knife." Ignoring his flippancy, Elise continued, her words tumbling out like a spill of marbles. "The plague, it reacts to human paradoxes because of a hidden strength in our psyche, something about cognitive dissonance that confuses it. But I've managed to amplify this effect using a combination of, well, let's call it science voodoo." Jax, who had been eavesdropping while pretending to reroute power, raised an eyebrow. "So what, we just shout contradictions at them until they run away screaming?" "Pretty much," Elise said, her grin as sharp as a razor. "Except now we can broadcast it on a scale that'll make them think twice before crashing our party." Thane shook his head, half in disbelief, half in admiration. "You know, I always said humans would be the death of us all. Turns out, it just might save our asses instead." Vera appeared from under a heap of what looked like technological roadkill, rubbing grease off her hands. "Sounds like a plan that's just crazy enough to work, but we need to make sure our little trick doesn't backfire." "Backfire how?" Thane asked, his curiosity piqued despite the situation. "Well," Elise began, hesitation creeping into her cheerfulness, "if the paradox effect is too strong, it might not just confuse them, it could drive them into a frenzy. Picture angry bees with tentacles and a vendetta." "Wonderful," Thane sighed. "Guess there's no easy way out, huh? Fine, we hit them with everything we've got, make sure they leave with a splitting headache and a reason to avoid humanity like the plague they sent." Jax chuckled, his laughter a welcome sound amidst the chaos. "Let's give them a taste of human contradiction they'll never forget." After all, who else can argue politics and religion at family dinners without starting Armageddon? "All right," Thane said, addressing his crew. "Elise, you work on amplifying that paradox effect. Vera, make sure we have enough power to keep this heap running long enough to pull it off. Jax, keep an eye on those aliens. If they so much as sneeze in our direction, I want to know. The crew nodded and scattered like cockroaches under a flashlight, each person driven by the knowledge that failure wasn't an option, not unless they fancied becoming alien chew toys. Elise hunkered down at her console, her fingers dancing across the keys like she was orchestrating a symphony of madness. We need to broadcast a series of contradictory statements at specific frequencies. It'll be like playing a really bad mixtape at max volume, she explained, not looking up from her work. A mixtape? Thane quipped. I didn't know we were planning to defeat them with the power of terrible taste in music. Close enough, she retorted, shooting him a look that could melt ice. But this mixtape is going to make their ears bleed if they have ears. Not sure where they keep those. Whatever you say, Doc, Thane replied, wincing as he gingerly adjusted his position. Time ticked by, each second a reminder of how close they were to either victory or annihilation. The ship's engines hummed their disgruntled chorus, a testament to their tenuous grip on existence. All right, folks, Thane announced, mustering the last shreds of his bravado. Let's get this circus on the road. Elise, are we ready? As ready as we'll ever be, she said, her expression a mix of determination and something close to insanity. Vera, how's the power? Thane inquired, trying to sound like a captain who hadn't just reached the end of his rope. We've got enough juice to power a small city, Vera replied. Or fry us all if this goes wrong. Perfect, Thane said dryly. Jax, any movement? They're gathering, Jax reported, his tone suddenly serious. Looks like they're getting ready for another charge, and believe me, they don't look like they're bringing welcome gifts. Then let's not disappoint them, Thane said, his resolve hardening with each word. Elise hit it. Elise initiated the sequence, her fingers a blur of activity. The ship's systems groaned in protest, lights flickering as if caught in their own internal battle between functioning and giving up. The effect was almost immediate. Outside, the aliens hesitated, their advance stuttering as if they'd lost their script mid-performance. Their confusion was a tangible thing, and for the first time, a sliver of hope crept into Thane's heart. It's working, Elise whispered, disbelief and excitement coloring her voice. The aliens faltered, their grotesque forms twitching as the amplified paradoxes seeped into their consciousness. It was like watching a horror movie in reverse, the monsters retreating from the light rather than advancing into it. Keep pushing, Thane urged, his gaze fixed on the screens displaying the alien retreat. Don't give them a chance to regroup. The ship, their battered sanctuary, thrummed with energy, the paradoxes pouring out like an angry river. It was a chaotic symphony of contradictions. Human insanity turned weapon, and it was glorious. Suddenly, an alarm blared, cutting through the moment like a knife. Vera swore, her hands flying over controls. We've got a power surge, just what we needed, Thane grumbled, his earlier optimism taking a nosedive. Can we stabilize it? Working on it, Vera snapped, her voice laced with tension. But if we don't, we're looking at one hell of a fireworks show. Jax, help her, Thane ordered, his mind racing through contingencies that barely existed. Jax was already moving, his earlier levity gone as he dove into the tangled mess of wires and circuits. We've got this, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The ship shuddered, a reminder that they were playing with forces beyond their control. The paradox effect continued to wreak havoc on the aliens, but if they couldn't stabilize the power, it wouldn't matter. Thane, we're going to need to shut down some systems to redirect power, Vera said, her voice calm despite the chaos. Do it, Thane replied, knowing full well the risks involved. Whatever it takes to keep this running. Seconds stretched into agonizing eternity as they worked, their lives hanging in the balance. The power surge threatened to overwhelm them, but they fought back with every ounce of grit they had left. Finally, with a triumphant whoop, Jax threw a switch and the ship's system steadied, the lights returning to a more forgiving brightness. We're stable, Vera confirmed, her relief palpable. For now, anyway. Sane exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Good work, all of you. Let's finish this. The paradoxes continued their assault, an unrelenting barrage of nonsense that was doing what weapons never could, turning the tide in their favor. The aliens were in full retreat, their once terrifying visage now a mere shadow of its former menace. We did it, Elise said, her voice filled with wonder. We actually did it. Sane allowed himself a moment to savor the victory. It was a taste as sweet as the finest whiskey he'd never had the chance to try, but he knew they couldn't afford to rest on their laurels. Not yet. All right, folks, he said, his voice cutting through the lingering tension. We've won this battle, but the war's far from over. They'll come back, and when they do, they'll be angrier than a hornet in a hornet's nest that's on fire. So what's next? Jax asked, his tone halfway between exhaustion and exhilaration. We get ready, Thane replied, his resolve firm. And next time we hit them harder, smarter. We'll show them that humans aren't just good at surviving, we're damn good at thriving. Elise nodded, her eyes gleaming with determination. I'll refine the paradox effect, make it even more potent, and I'll make sure our tin can holds together long enough to see it through, Vera added, her practical nature a steadying force. Sounds like a plan, Thane said, feeling a spark of hope ignite once more. They had a fighting chance, not just to survive, but to win. As they regrouped, battered but not beaten, Thane reflected on the strength that had seen them through. It wasn't just the paradoxes or the science voodoo. It was human spirit, stubborn, irreverent, and just a little bit insane. With a weary smile, Thane addressed his crew, his family. Here's to us and the madness that keeps us alive. And as they prepared for whatever came next, Thane knew that in a universe teeming with darkness, they were a light that refused to be extinguished. Thane Garrows watched the screens, the alien retreat playing out like a poorly scripted drama. It was satisfying in a take your victory where you can get it kind of way. He couldn't suppress a grin, even though the universe had a talent for kicking him in the teeth whenever he dared to smile. Didn't think we'd be sending those tentacled bastards running with the power of human stupidity, Thane mused, rubbing at the ache in his shoulder. He'd had smoother rides on the back of a drunken mule, one with a grudge. Elise looked up from her console, a gleam of triumph in her eyes. Never underestimate the power of contradiction, or a bad mixtape, apparently. Yeah, remind me to never let you DJ, Thane retorted, trying to ignore the persistent throbbing in his head. It was like his brain was holding a riot to protest his life choices. Jax was still tangled in wires, looking like he'd lost a fight with a mechanical octopus. So, we're heroes now, right? Get a parade and everything, I wouldn't hold your breath, Thane said. Last time I checked, the universe isn't big on happy endings. Vera snorted from her post, wiping sweat from her brow. Yeah, I didn't see any confetti in the budget. Just duct tape and dumb luck. Speaking of which, Elise cut in, her tone turning serious. We've got to keep this thing going. The paradox effect needs to be maintained until we're sure they're done running. Right, Thane nodded, steeling himself for the next round of madness. Let's keep the pressure on. Make him regret ever messing with humans. The ship groaned as it channeled more power into the paradox broadcast. It felt like trying to run a marathon on a diet of stale coffee and anxiety. Feels like we're riding a dinosaur with a jetpack, Jax muttered, his fingers darting over the controls to stabilize the power flow. One wrong move and we're Dino Chow, poetic, Vera said, her sarcasm as dry as the vacuum outside. But let's aim for not crashing and burning. Thane watched the screens, the aliens still twitching and retreating. It was like watching a bad dance recital, all flailing limbs and missed beats. There was something grimly satisfying about seeing creatures that had wreaked so much havoc reduced to confusion and chaos. All right, Elise, Thane said, his gaze flicking between his crew and the unfolding alien retreat. How much more can we push this before we're the ones running in circles? Elise tapped her console with a mix of pride and caution. We're at the limit, Captain. Any more, and we risk turning ourselves into the galaxy's biggest migraine. Fantastic, Thane replied, his voice heavy with irony. We're saving the universe, but we might just end it with a massive headache. Hey, at least we'd go out with a bang, Jax quipped, untangling himself from the cables. Or maybe a whimper if the power fails first. Let's aim for neither, shall we? Vera said, adjusting the power levels with a deft touch. I'd rather not end up as space debris. As the ship continued its paradox-fueled assault, Thane kept his focus sharp. Every second mattered, every flicker of the lights a reminder of how precarious their position really was. Looks like they're finally getting the hint, Elise observed, her eyes glued to the screens. Their retreat's turning into a full-blown retreat. Good, Thane said, relief threading through his voice. Let's keep it that way. No need for a second performance. As the realization of their success settled in, the crew shared a rare moment of camaraderie, a fleeting feeling of triumph in a universe that seldom gave them any reason to celebrate. And yet, Thane knew better than to get too comfortable. In a world where survival was more a suggestion than a guarantee, complacency was just another word for dead. All right, Thane called, rallying his crew. Don't uncork the champagne just yet. We've given them a bloody nose, but they'll be back. Let's make sure we're ready when they do. You're a real ray of sunshine, you know that. Jax replied, though his words were softened by a grin. Part of my charm, Thane shot back, wincing as he shifted his weight. Now let's make sure our ship doesn't fall apart before we get a chance to gloat. As Elise and Jax returned to their stations, Vera double-checked the power settings, her movements precise and practiced. Thane watched them, a sense of pride swelling despite the circumstances. They were battered, bruised, and one wrong move away from disaster, but they were still standing, still fighting. And in this universe, that was as close to a victory as they were likely to get. No rest for the wicked, Thane muttered, his voice a mix of exhaustion and resolve. Let's make sure we're ready for round two. The crew moved with renewed purpose, their resolve hardened by the knowledge that they'd pulled off the impossible once. They could do it again if they had to, and they would, Thane knew. Because in a universe determined to snuff out the light, they were the stubborn spark that refused to die. As the Ayers ticked by, they worked tirelessly to prepare for whatever came next. The aliens had been beaten back, but the victory felt tenuous, a temporary reprieve in an unrelenting storm. Captain, Vera said, breaking the silence with her steady voice. The ship's holding together, but we're going to need a miracle to keep it that way. Miracles I can do without, Thane replied, casting a wry glance her way. Just make sure her duct tape halo stays intact. Jax chuckled, shaking his head. You know, for a bunch of ragtag survivors, we're doing pretty well for ourselves. Speak for yourself, Elise chimed in, not looking up from her work. I'm one step away from rebranding as a full-time mad scientist. Let's aim for mad genius, shall we? Thane suggested, his tone light despite the gravity of their situation. The ship hummed around them, a battered fortress in a sea of uncertainty. The engine's disgruntled growl was a familiar sound, a testament to both their resilience and their precarious position. All right, folks, Thane said, his voice carrying the weight of leadership and a touch of humor. Let's keep this mess from falling apart. We've got a galaxy to save, after all. Elise glanced up, a rare smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. And who better to do it than us? As they worked, Thane couldn't help but reflect on the irony of it all. A group of misfits held together by duct tape and determination, standing against the tide of destruction. It was absurd, really. But then, when had humanity ever been anything else? An endless paradox, a walking contradiction, a species that thrived in the chaos it so often created. Here's to us, Thane murmured under his breath, a quiet toast to his crew and the madness that kept them alive. In the dim light of their makeshift sanctuary, they pressed on, the weight of the universe bearing down, but their spirits unbowed. The aliens might return, the plague might spread, but they would be ready. Because in a universe that thrived on cruelty and chaos, they were the defiant note of laughter, the stubborn flicker of hope. And for now, that was enough. As the Ayers stretched into an endless night, they continued their work, each absorbed in their own tasks, yet bound by the same unyielding purpose. For Thane, it was a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the galaxy, there was light. Even in the depths of despair, there was hope. And as long as they had each other, they would fight, they would survive, and maybe, just maybe, they'd find a way to win. Captain, Ely said, her voice soft but steady, we're ready for whatever comes next. Thane nodded, his heart swelling with pride. Good, because whatever happens, we're not going down without a fight. The crew shared a look, a silent vow in the dim light. Together, they would face whatever the universe threw their way, and they would do it with a grin, a laugh, and a middle finger raised to the stars. Let's show him what we're made of, Thane said, his voice a challenge and a promise. Let's show him what it means to be human. And as they prepared for the unknown, Thane knew they were ready, because they were more than survivors. They were warriors, dreamers, and stubborn fools who refused to quit. In a galaxy filled with darkness, they were the light, a blazing, brilliant defiance that refused to be snuffed out. Here we go, Thane whispered, his gaze fixed on the stars beyond. Let's finish this. And with that, they moved forward, daring the universe to do its worst. Because in this endless dance of survival and struggle, they were more than just players. They were the masters of their own fate, and they would win. The ship's engines hummed in the background like an overworked coffee machine trying its damnedest to brew something vaguely drinkable. A fitting soundtrack for a crew of caffeine-deprived misfits in space. Captain Thane Garrows leaned back in his chair, which creaked ominously, as if one more existential crisis might push it over the edge. But hell, they were all on the edge, weren't they? So, we've outsmarted an alien plague with the power of good all-human paradoxes, Thane mused aloud, rubbing his temples. Who knew our greatest weapon was our own contradictory nature? I should have seen it coming. If anyone could frustrate an alien species to death, it's us. Vera, ever the skeptic, sat cross-legged across from him, her brow furrowed in thought. It's a bit rich, isn't it? She said, her voice like gravel laced with sarcasm. The universe throws an existential threat at us, and we fight back with contradictions and duct tape. Makes you wonder if Earth was really a testing ground for cosmic irony. Maybe that's why we never got invited to join any interstellar federations. Jax chimed in from his perch, still occasionally untangling some last stubborn wires. Too much paradox, not enough diplomacy. Can you imagine us at a galactic summit? We'd probably set off an intergalactic incident just by introducing ourselves. Elise chuckled, her eyes still glued to her console, a glowing beacon of stress and potential disaster. We've literally weaponized cognitive dissonance. Alien biology can't handle the cognitive cluster bomb that is a human trying to understand taxes. I wonder if we should thank them for not trying to nuke us on site. Thane glanced up at the control room's chaotic mess, a scrapyard that had once dreamed of being a starship. Maybe we should give chaos a medal. It's pretty much the only thing holding us together. As the laughter subsided, a more sobering thought lingered in the air. They'd won a battle, sure, but the war, a universe hell-bent on tearing their fragile existence apart, was far from over. The plague's retreat felt less like a victory and more like a reprieve, the eye of a cosmic storm that could resume its fury at any moment. "So, what now?" Thane asked, a hint of weariness in his voice. "Do we just sit around waiting for the universe to try killing us again, or do we get proactive about it?" Vera shrugged, her expression a masterclass in nonchalance. "We've got a smidge of breathing room, which is more than I expected to have by now. Maybe it's time we stop reacting and start exploring. Find out what other delightful surprises the universe has up its sleeve." Elise looked up, a rare gleam of excitement in her eyes. "I could get behind that. There's so much we don't know about this plague and what it means for us. If paradox is our weapon, maybe understanding it better could give us an edge. Hell, maybe even a chance at coexistence. Coexistence." "You're getting soft, Elise," Jax teased, though his grin was genuine. "Next you'll be saying we should try diplomacy. Don't get your hopes up," she shot back, though her smile betrayed her. "I'm still firmly in the shoot first, ask questions later camp, but maybe there's room for both." With a collective sigh, the crew let the idea settle, a shift from desperate survival to something resembling hope. It was a tenuous hope, but hope nonetheless. "All right," Thane said, clapping his hands together, which was only slightly more effective than duct tape for holding morale. "Let's chart a course. See if we can't find some answers before the universe decides to throw another cosmic wrench our way. Let's just hope the wrench isn't big enough to tear through the hull," Vera muttered, though her fingers moved deftly over her controls, already plotting their next steps. The ship's engines grumbled in agreement, as if protesting the very idea of further travel, but still willing to give it a go out of sheer stubbornness, or maybe just habit. They moved with renewed purpose, a ragtag band of survivors turned explorers, ready to confront whatever interstellar absurdity awaited them. They had paradox on their side, after all, and if that wasn't enough to make the universe sit up and take notice, nothing would. As the control room buzzed with the familiar, comforting chaos of a crew at work, Thane allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. Here they were, patching up a ship held together by more wishful thinking than metal-defying odds that made survival seem almost laughable. But then wasn't that the human condition, a constant, maddening dance with fate where the rules were made up on the fly and survival was always a maybe, never a guarantee? "Look at us," Thane murmured, perhaps more to himself than anyone else. "A bunch of stubborn idiots with a ghost ship and a dream. Who'd have thought?" Elise caught his eye, a knowing glint in hers. "Stubbornness is underrated. It keeps us going when logic and reason jump ship." "Well," Thane replied, a smirk playing on his lips, "we might as well give stubbornness a run for its money. The universe hasn't seen the last of us yet." As they slipped into the vastness of space, their battered ship a defiant speck against the infinite stars, they carried with them the hope of possibility. The possibility of new worlds, new discoveries, and maybe, just maybe, a way to turn paradox into power. And so they ventured on, propelled by duct tape, determination, and the kind of reckless optimism that only the truly doomed could appreciate. Whatever lay ahead, they'd face it together, with sarcasm as their shield and irony their sword. In the end, perhaps that was the real victory, a crew unlikely and imperfect, yet undeniably human, laughing in the face of the very cosmos that sought to destroy them. As they sailed through the void, Thane knew one thing for certain: they were more than survivors. They were the damned lucky fools who dared to turn the universe's chaos into their own destiny. "And if we have to blow up a few things to get there," he said, grinning at his crew, "all the better." With a chorus of laughter they set forth, the masters of their own fate, ready to challenge whatever came next. Because in a universe as vast and unpredictable as theirs, they refused to be anything less than extraordinary.